I didn't expect anyone to be waiting for me. Especially not a dog. But there he was, a massive, shaggy shape sprawled across the porch like he owned it, head resting on his front paws, tail thumping once, slowly, as I stepped out of the rental car and into the quiet that surrounded my grandmother's cottage. He didn't bark. Didn't growl. Didn't even lift his head. He just watched me. Like he already knew I was coming. The cottage sat at the edge of a thinning pine forest, wrapped in stone and ivy, just far enough from town to feel like it belonged to the past. It had been 4 years since I'd last been here. 4 years since Grandma Elsie passed, and the house had gone still. And yet, nothing looked abandoned. The shutters were closed. The porch plants, though a little dry, were upright in their pots. The roof was mossy but intact. There were no spiderwebs across the doorframe. No dust on the brass doorknob. And then there was him. The dog. Big. Silent. Strange. "Hey, bud," I said softly, taking a cautious step forward. He blinked. Just once. "I don't know whose you are, but this isn't a good time." Still no response. I sighed, dropped my bag to the porch, and glanced at the door. No key needed. I'd been told the lock barely worked anyway. It creaked open with a push, the scent of cedar and dry books drifting out to meet me. Everything was exactly as I remembered. The floral print couch. The crooked lamp. The handmade quilt thrown over the armchair. It was like time had folded in on itself. And yet, I felt tired. Bone-deep tired. Like the grief I'd buried years ago had been waiting here, quiet, gathering dust in the corners. I came to this place to be alone. After the burnout. After quitting my job. After waking up one morning and realizing I couldn't remember the last time I'd smiled without effort. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to be touched. I didn't want anyone to ask how I was doing with that concerned tilt of the head. I just wanted to sleep. And breathe. And maybe, if the silence was kind, start over. So the last thing I needed was some stranger's stray dog parked on the porch like he'd signed a lease. That night, I tried to ignore him. I made a bed on the couch instead of the bedroom. It felt closer to the door, less final somehow. I pulled the quilt over me, left the light off, and let the sound of wind through pine lull me into a light, aching sleep. But at 2:17 a.m., I woke to something strange. Everything smelled clean. Too clean. I blinked in the dark. Sat up. And froze. The front door was closed. I knew I'd left it cracked, out of habit, out of laziness. But now it was latched. And the rug? Straightened. Aligned. Neat. I rubbed my eyes and got up, heart knocking gently. Nothing else was out of place. No signs of entry. No wind damage. Just stillness. I opened the door. The dog was lying there. Exactly where he'd been earlier. Head down. Eyes closed. Not sleeping, just resting. Aware. Like a sentry. He didn't look at me. But something in my chest shifted. And I whispered, "Did you do that?" He didn't move. The next morning, he was still there. I made coffee in the old percolator, the way Grandma used to. The dog didn't bark, didn't whine. He didn't beg for scraps or chase birds. He just sat by the steps, eyes half-lidded, ears flicking with every shift in the wind. I sipped slowly, sitting on the edge of the porch with my knees pulled to my chest. "Okay," I said aloud. "Maybe you're not just a dog." That was the moment I decided to give him a name. Not because I thought he needed one. Because I needed a way to talk to something that wouldn't talk back. I looked him over. Thick fur, almost black in some places, deep gray in others. One ear slightly bent at the tip. Muzzle dusted with white. Eyes dark and unreadable. "Shadow," I murmured. "That's what you look like." He lifted his head at the sound. Didn't wag. Didn't bark. just looked at me. And I felt something soften. That night, I gave up trying to keep him off the porch. I set out an old bowl of water, tore a piece of bread in half, and placed it near the steps. He waited until I went inside before approaching. By the time I peeked through the window, the food was gone, but the bowl was untouched. Inside, I curled beneath the quilt and stared at the ceiling. The quiet wasn't heavy anymore. It was curious. I must have fallen asleep around midnight. And when I woke, the world had rearranged itself again. This time, it was subtle. The books on the shelf, which had been tilted sideways, were now aligned neatly by height. The tea mug I'd left in the sink was gone. Not cleaned. Just gone. And by the window, folded and placed gently across the back of the chair. Grandma's shawl. I hadn't touched it since I arrived. I stared at it for a long time. Then turned toward the door. Shadow was lying in the exact same spot as before. But this time, his eyes were open. Watching me. Not waiting. Not hoping. Just aware. Like he knew I'd finally noticed. I stopped trying to explain it after the third morning. The first night, it had been the rug. The second, the bookshelf and the missing tea mug. And now, on the third, I woke up to find my grandmother's reading glasses, which had been packed away in a drawer, resting on the kitchen table. Right beside a spoon. A single spoon perfectly polished. I hadn't used a spoon in days. I stared at the table for a long time, my breath shallow. The house was quiet. Still. There were no footprints on the dusty floorboards. No sign that anyone, human or animal, had wandered through during the night. But the spoon gleamed. And the glasses. I picked them up gently, running my fingers over the frame. They were slightly warm. As if they had just been touched. I turned toward the door. Shadow lay exactly where I had left him the night before. Curled in a crescent near the porch railing, thick tail tucked around his side, one ear twitching faintly in the morning breeze. As if nothing had happened. That day, I left the front door open. Not all the way. Just a few inches. Enough to see. Enough to test something I wasn't sure I wanted the answer to. I sat in the living room and watched him. He didn't move. Not when I shifted on the couch, not when I rustled the newspaper, not even when I said his name out loud, softly, almost like a dare. Shadow? His ear flicked. His eyes opened. But he didn't get up. Didn't come inside. Didn't even stretch. He just looked. Right at me. Long enough for it to feel like more than just attention. Long enough for it to feel like intention. By the afternoon, I had convinced myself it was stress. A kind of burnout-induced hallucination. I'd read about it, how the mind, starved for connection, starts inventing patterns, assigning meaning to accidents. I even Googled emotional projection onto animals and scrolled through psychology forums while sipping lukewarm tea. But none of the explanations felt right. Because deep down, I wasn't scared. I was seen. And I didn't know how to handle that. That evening, I made 2 grilled cheese sandwiches instead of 1. I told myself it was just habit. That maybe I was hungrier than I thought. I placed the second one on a plate and set it just inside the front door. I didn't look at him when I did it. Didn't speak. Just left it there. By morning, the plate was empty. But the fork I'd used? Cleaned. And set neatly beside the sink. I started writing things down after that. Not full journal entries, just single-line notes on scrap paper. Night 4, window closed when I left it open. Night 5, tea bag removed from cup and set on saucer. Cup untouched. Night 6, my sketchbook placed beside the couch. Open to the last page I drew as a child. The sketchbook rattled me. I hadn't seen it in years. It had been in a box under the bed. I was sure of it. I hadn't even opened it since moving in. But there it was, page open, smudged lines of a clumsy drawing of Grandma Elsie in her rocking chair. I must have been 6 when I drew it. And now it was here. On the table. Waiting. That day, I finally asked the question aloud. To the house.to the woods.to shadow. Why are you helping me? I didn't expect a reply. But part of me hoped he'd blink. Move. Shift. Show something. He didn't. He just looked at me. Like always. But something in his gaze softened. And I felt it in my chest. Not an answer but a knowing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on the couch, wrapped in the quilt, the windows open to the night air. Crickets sang. The pine trees creaked. And in the distance, the faint rustle of something four-legged padded across the porch. I sat up, heart racing. No lights. No movement. But then, the door creaked slightly. Just enough to open a crack. And then closed. Quietly. Not slammed. Not pushed. Closed. I crept forward, eased the door open. Shadow was lying in his usual spot. But his eyes were open. Watching the trees. Not me. Still. The next morning, something had changed again. And this time, it wasn't something I could explain away. On the kitchen table sat a photo frame. Wooden. Faded. Inside it, a picture I hadn't seen in years. Me age 9. Standing barefoot on this very porch, holding a glass of lemonade, my grandmother behind me in her favorite summer dress, laughing. I staggered back. I hadn't brought this with me. I didn't even remember it existed. The photo albums had all been left at Mum's house. I picked up the frame with shaking hands and turned it over. There was a small note taped to the back. You were happy here. My knees nearly buckled. Because the handwriting. It wasn't mine. It was hers. I ran to the door. Shadow was sitting upright now, watching me through the screen. I opened it slowly, stepped onto the porch. He didn't move. Didn't flinch. Just looked at me. And for the first time since I arrived, I sank to my knees beside him. I don't know how you're doing this, I whispered. Or why. But I think. I stopped. Swallowed. I think I needed you. He didn't wag his tail. Didn't lick my face. He wasn't that kind of dog. Instead, he lowered his head. And leaned it, gently, carefully, against my arm. Just for a moment. Then pulled back. But it was enough. That night, I locked the doors. Not to keep him out. But because I knew now, he didn't need a door. He came and went in ways I couldn't track. Maybe he always had. Maybe he always would. But something had shifted between us. It wasn't just the house that was rearranging. It was me. When I lay down to sleep, I placed the photograph beside my pillow. And whispered into the quiet, whatever you do tonight, thank you. And then, I slept. Not restlessly, not lightly. But deep. Safe. And certain that when I woke, something else would have changed. I decided to fake it. No more guessing. No more waking up to rearranged teacups and mystery photographs. I needed to know. What did he do while I was sleeping? I planned it like a child scheming past bedtime. Around 10:30 p.m., I turned off the lights, made a small show of stretching and yawning, and curled up on the couch with my back to the front door. The quilt was wrapped loosely around me. One eye barely open. The mug of tea beside me left unfinished, exactly the way I knew he'd expect it. I slowed my breathing, soft. Deep. Rhythmic. And waited. At first, nothing. The house settled into its familiar nighttime creaks. The wind rustled against the windows. Somewhere outside, an owl called, low and mournful. Then, silence. Thicker than before. The kind of silence that makes you feel watched. My fingers tensed under the blanket. I didn't move. Not even when I heard the softest sound at the door, like paw pads brushing wood. A gentle click. The door didn't open all the way. Just a few inches. Enough. And then, he was there. Shadow. He entered the house like a whisper. No nails on the floorboards. No heavy breathing. Just presence. He moved with impossible gentleness, not like a dog, not like anything I knew. More like a shadow stepping between worlds. First, he sniffed the air. Briefly. Then he walked to the kitchen. I kept my breathing steady. Every nerve in my body wanted to lift my head, to peek. But I didn't. Not yet. I listened. There was the sound of movement. A small clink. The brush of something being placed down. A drawer sliding open. A pause. Then, footsteps again. This time, closer. I swallowed, slowly. He was in the living room now. Right behind me. I felt it, not heat, not touch, just awareness. The kind that makes your spine hum. And then, he stepped closer. I nearly lost my rhythm. Closer. A warm breath near my shoulder. And then, he placed something beside my pillow. Soft. Careful. I waited. He stayed there for a few seconds, maybe watching. Maybe deciding. Then his weight shifted. And he left. Not out the door. Toward the back of the house. Toward the bedroom. I waited a full 5 minutes before daring to move. When I finally turned my head, heart pounding, I saw it. A photo. Old. Faded at the edges. I picked it up with trembling hands. Me age 5. Asleep on Grandma Elsie's lap in that very armchair. A book open in her hands. My hand resting over hers. I didn't even remember that picture being taken. But I remembered the moment. And suddenly I was crying. Not from fear. Not even from wonder. From being known. I stood up, wiping my cheeks, and followed him. The back hallway was dim. The moonlight spilled in through a window, casting silver across the floor. I stepped softly toward the bedroom door. It was ajar. And Shadow? He was there. Not rummaging. Not pacing. Just sitting. On the rug. Facing the closet. Perfectly still. I leaned against the doorframe, unsure if he noticed me. Shadow, I whispered. He didn't look back. But his ears twitched. I stepped inside. What are you doing? He turned his head slightly, then looked back at the closet. I followed his gaze. It was the old cedar chest. One I hadn't opened since arriving. One I hadn't even thought about, buried beneath blankets and a few dusty boxes. Shadow stood up. Walked over. Sat again. Facing it. Patient. Intentional. Like he was waiting for me to open it. I hesitated. Then knelt. The lid creaked as I lifted it. Inside, linens. Stacked neatly. A faded quilt. A small box labeled winter letters. And at the bottom, something wrapped in a silk scarf. I unwrapped it slowly. A journal. Grandma's. Brown leather. Hand-stitched. The same one she always kept close. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside the front cover, in her handwriting. For Lena. When you're ready. I sat on the rug. Shadow curled beside me. And I read. Hours passed. The journal wasn't long, maybe 50 pages. But every page was her voice. Some memories. Some advice. Some stories about my parents before they divorced. Others about me, as a child. Quiet. Observant. full of questions but rarely asked them out loud. She wrote about the cottage. About aging. About what it felt like to know time was growing short. If Lena ever returns here, she wrote near the end, please let her find something worth staying for. Something gentle. Something that watches over her, even when she doesn't believe she deserves it. I ran my fingers over the ink until the words blurred. Then I looked at Shadow. Still beside me. Still awake. Still watching. And I whispered, was it you she meant? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. That night, I didn't sleep on the couch. I curled up on the rug, the journal beside me, Shadow curled behind me like a shield. And I slept like I hadn't in years. No bad dreams. No ghosts, only breath. Only warmth. Only quiet. When I woke the next morning, the journal was back in the chest. The closet was closed. And Shadow? He was gone. Not far. Just outside. Lying in the grass, beneath the oak tree. Eyes closed. Facing the rising sun. After the journal, I started looking at everything differently. Not just at Shadow. At the house. At the woods. At myself. It was like a switch had flipped, and I could finally see the world not as it was, but as it had always tried to be, waiting for me to notice. The next few days passed slowly. Softly. Shadow stayed nearby. He didn't follow me constantly. He didn't beg for attention or treats or playtime. He simply existed in the edges of my world, always within reach, always quiet. Like he was there to anchor me, not distract me, not fill space. Just hold it. I began taking walks again. At first, only down the winding gravel road past the old garden fence, where the grass had grown high around the mailbox and birds nested in the tall sunflowers. Then further, into the woods behind the house, where the air was cooler, older. Where the pine needles muffled every step and the world felt like it had forgotten time. Shadow walked behind me. Not beside. Not leading. Guarding. I never told him to come. But he always did. One morning, I stopped at the edge of the clearing, where the old apple tree leaned low, its bark split and weathered with age, and sat on a stump, just breathing. I had nothing with me. No phone. No bag, not even my journal. Just myself. And Shadow. He circled once, then lay beside me. We stayed like that for a long while. And then I said it. Out loud. I don't think you're just a dog. He didn't flinch. Didn't blink. But I felt something shift. Something in the air. Like the breeze itself had paused, listening. I think, you're here for a reason. The words tasted strange in my mouth, half foolish, half sacred. I laughed softly. God, I sound like I'm talking to a ghost. A leaf fell from the tree above and landed on his back. He didn't shake it off. Later that afternoon, I opened the cedar chest again. This time, not to read. Just to feel. The blanket inside smelled like her. Lavender and wood smoke. The letters were still there, tied with ribbon. I held them for a while but didn't open them. Not yet. Shadow sat in the doorway, watching. I used to think grief was loud, I said. That it came in sobs and shouting and breakdowns. I glanced at him. But this? This kind of grief is different. It's quiet. It moves in furniture and tea mugs and old songs on the radio. It hides in the cracks. He blinked. And you're not trying to fix it, are you? His head tilted, just a little. I nodded. You're just here. Letting me feel it. He stepped into the room, circled once, and lay down beside the bed. Close. But not touching. That evening, something strange happened. The old radio, the one on the kitchen shelf that hadn't worked in years, clicked on by itself. I was in the hallway when I heard it. Faint static. Then a flicker of music. I stepped into the kitchen slowly. Tea planned. He just stood up after breakfast, turned, and started walking into the woods. No leash. No look back. No command. Just movement. I followed. The trail was narrow, barely visible, the kind that only deer or foxes might use. But he knew exactly where he was going. Past the big rock, over the creek bed, through a grove of birch trees white as bone. And then, he stopped. At a small clearing, sun-drenched still. At the center, a stone. Rounded. Smoothed by time. Covered in ivy. I stepped forward. Pushed the ivy aside. And read. 1932, 2019 inch a heart that watched over everything, even in silence. Grandma. Her resting place. Unmarked on any map. Hidden. I dropped to my knees. Shadow lay beside me, not watching, not moving. Just there. And I let go. The sob rose before I could stop it. Not sharp. Not painful. Just full. Full of years. Of memory. Of all the things I hadn't said, and didn't need to. Because somehow, through him, she'd heard me. We stayed there until the sun started to dip. I traced the edges of the stone with my fingers. Let the ivy fall back over gently. Pressed my forehead to the earth. Then stood. And whispered, "Thank you." I didn't know if I meant it for her, for Shadow, for both. Maybe it didn't matter. When we got back to the cottage, I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't write. I didn't speak. I just sat in the dark, candle flickering, and watched the way Shadow curled on the rug like he always had. But this time, I knew. He wasn't guarding me from danger. He wasn't protecting me from fear. He was simply walking me home. The night before I was supposed to leave, I didn't tell Shadow. But I think he knew. He had always known. I had packed my bags by late afternoon. Slowly. Not because there was much to take, just a few clothes, a sketchbook, Grandma's journal, a letter I still hadn't opened, but because every movement felt final. Ritualistic. The kind you perform when you know the air will be different afterward. The kind that lets you say goodbye without words. That evening, the sun lingered longer than usual. The house was quiet. The wind had stilled. Even the woods beyond the fence held their breath. I cooked one last dinner on the old stove, soup and warm bread. Shadow lay near the door as always, watching, but closer than usual. He didn't follow me into the kitchen. Didn't beg for a bite. He just lay there, still and silent, his eyes on me like he was memorizing something. And maybe he was. I left the soup pot on the stove, the bread on the table, and walked out to the back porch. I didn't bother with shoes. The wooden planks were still warm from the day. Shadow followed. We sat there, side by side, under the stars that blinked slowly into place. No words. No gestures. Just presence. As it had always been. "Do you think I'm ready?" I asked him softly. He didn't look at me. Just stared into the woods. I smiled, a little. "That's fair. You've never told me anything before. Why start now?" He sighed, a deep, steady sound that rose from his chest like wind through pine. And I understood. That was his answer. Later, I crawled into bed for the first time since arriving, not the couch, not the floor, but the bedroom where Grandma had once slept, where the windows faced the garden and the shadows didn't feel like ghosts anymore. The quilt was already folded back. The pillow fluffed. The lamp beside the bed glowing dimly. He had prepared it. I didn't ask how. By now, I didn't need to. Shadow didn't follow me in. He stayed at the threshold, his paws just inside the doorway, his body outside the light. I looked at him, hand resting over my heart. And whispered, "You can come in." He didn't move. And for the first time I realized. He wasn't staying. Not tonight. Not anymore. I swallowed the ache. "Thank you," I said. His head dipped. Barely. And then, without a sound, he turned and walked away. I lay down, pulled the quilt to my chin, and stared at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come immediately. I didn't want it to. Because I knew what it meant. If I slept, he would leave. And I wouldn't get to say goodbye. But sleep always wins. Sometime past midnight, I slipped under. No dreams. No waking. Just dark, warm rest. When I opened my eyes, sunlight filtered through the window, golden and soft. I blinked. Sat up. The room was quiet. Still. And I knew. Before I even rose from the bed, I knew. He was gone. I rushed to the door. Threw it open. No paw prints in the dew. No fur on the porch. No movement on the path. Nothing. Just morning birdsong and a smell of damp soil. The cottage felt suddenly too big. Too light. Too empty. I stood there for a long time. Waiting for him to appear at the edge of the woods. But he didn't. Back inside, the house was exactly as I had left it. Except for one thing. On the windowsill beside the kitchen table, carved gently into the wood, where Grandma's herb pots once sat, were 4 words. "You're ready now." I reached out and touched them with trembling fingers. The grooves were shallow, careful, like someone had etched them slowly, not to damage, but to offer. And beside it, just below the words, 1 paw print. Pressed into the wood. Not painted. Not scratched. Pressed. Like it had always been there. Waiting to be revealed. I didn't cry. Not right away. Because part of me felt lifted. Not in a joyful, flying way. But in the way you feel when someone's been holding your hand through the dark, and finally lets go. Because they know you can walk now. That afternoon, I delayed my departure. I took one last walk through the woods. Past the birches, past the creek, back to the clearing with the stone. I laid a wildflower beside it. Sat on the grass. And whispered, "He found me. Just like you said." The wind shifted. Soft. Warm. And in it, I swear, I heard her voice. "You needed someone who could sit in your silence." Back at the cottage, I locked the door behind me, not out of fear, but out of ritual. I slid my hand over the paw print on the windowsill one last time. Smiled. And stepped into the sun. Epilogue, 1 month later. I'm back in the city now. The streets are louder. The sky thinner. The world faster. But something inside me is quiet. Still. And ready. I've started sketching again. Not for work. For myself. Dogs. Woods. Silence. And always, one shape in the background. Large. Steady. Shadowed. Not labeled, not explained. Just there. Like he always was. Sometimes, I leave my bedroom window cracked at night. And when the wind shifts, I swear I hear soft paws on the floorboards. But I don't open my eyes. I don't reach for him. Because I know now. He only comes when I'm sleeping. And when he's sure I'm okay. He lets go.